24 years. That's how long Susan Carter's voice echoed through empty courtrooms and Alex's laughter haunted Beckley's schoolyards. In the humid summer of 2000, a mother and daughter vanished from their West Virginia apartment, leaving behind only questions and a bullet embedded in a child's bedroom wall. For nearly a quarter century, investigators chased shadows while families clung to hope that refused to die. Search parties combed Appalachian forests. FBI agents followed leads that dissolved like morning mist. The case files gathered dust, but the community's wound never healed. Then came the confession. In a sterile hospital room, as death approached, an ordinary neighbor named Larry Webb whispered the truth that had festered in his conscience for decades. The bodies were buried 20 feet from his kitchen window. The killer had walked among them all those years, tending his garden above their graves. What drives a man to break his silence only when facing eternity? And how does a town reconcile with evil that hid in plain sight for over 2 decades? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning of August 8, 2000 arrived with a sticky heat that clung to West Virginia's summers like an unwelcome embrace. Beckley stirred to life slowly, porch lights clicking off as residents emerged to water gardens and collect newspapers. At the Carter apartment complex on Elm Street, the familiar rhythm of morning routines played out behind thin walls and screen doors. Susan Carter stepped onto her front porch at 7:30 a.m., her auburn hair catching the early sunlight. At 41, she carried herself with the careful composure of a woman navigating treacherous waters. Behind her, 10-year-old Alex bounded through the doorway, backpack bouncing against her small frame, dark curls escaping from yesterday's ponytail. "Morning, Susan," called Mrs. Henderson from across the parking lot, hanging wet sheets on a makeshift clothesline. Susan raised her hand in greeting, managing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The custody hearing loomed 3 days away, and sleep had become a luxury she couldn't afford. Her lawyer's voice echoed in her mind from their last meeting. Temporary custody is just that, temporary. Alex skipped toward their beat-up Honda Civic, humming a tune from the radio. At 10, she existed in that precious space between childhood wonder and adult awareness, though the tension between her parents had begun seeping into her world like water through a cracked foundation. Susan's medication bottles rattled softly in her purse as she searched for car keys. The antidepressants and anxiety pills had become necessities since the separation, prescribed barriers against the panic that threatened to overwhelm her during Mark's more aggressive visits. As they walked to the car, Susan caught sight of Larry Webb's pickup truck parked at an odd angle near the maintenance shed. Webb lived in the White House behind the complex, a quiet man in his 50s who kept to himself. Something about the truck's placement struck her as unusual, but she dismissed the thought. They pulled into the library parking lot at 8:15 a.m. The building wouldn't open until 9, but Susan often arrived early to sit quietly with Alex, stealing peaceful moments before the day's battles began. "There's Jenna," Alex pointed to a girl climbing out of a minivan. "Go say hi," Susan encouraged. "I'll watch from here." At exactly 9 o'clock a.m., the library doors opened. Susan walked Alex inside, signed her in for the program, and kissed her forehead goodbye. "Pick you up at noon?" Susan asked. "Can we get ice cream after?" "If you're good for Mrs. Patterson." It was the last conversation they would ever have. By 3 o'clock p.m., the summer heat had settled over Beckley like a wool blanket. Inside Beckley Elementary School's air-conditioned office, Mrs. Patterson checked her attendance roster for the 3rd time. Alex Carter's name stared back at her, unmarked. "Has anyone heard from the Carters?" she asked her assistant. "No calls, no messages?" came the reply. The phone rang 6 times before going to voicemail. Susan's recorded voice sounded cheerful and professional. "You've reached Susan Carter. Please leave a message." Mrs. Patterson tried again immediately, same result. At the Carter apartment complex, Mrs. Henderson noticed Susan's Honda Civic parked in its usual spot. The windows were rolled up, heat shimmering off the hood. It had been there since morning, which struck her as odd. She approached the apartment door and knocked gently. "Susan? Everything okay, honey?" Silence. Mrs. Henderson tried the doorknob and found it locked. The air conditioning unit hummed steadily, suggesting someone was home, but the stillness felt wrong. Mrs. Patterson made another call, this time to Mark Carter. Mark answered on the second ring, his voice sharp with impatience. "What?" "Mr. Carter, this is Janet Patterson from the summer reading program. Alex didn't attend today and we can't reach Susan." A pause. "What do you mean, didn't attend? Susan was supposed to drop her off." "Ate all day. She never arrived. We've been trying to call. I haven't heard from Susan since yesterday. Let me try calling her." Mark sat in his pickup truck outside the auto parts store where he worked, phone pressed to his ear. Susan's voicemail greeting played again, the 3rd time in 10 minutes. He tried her apartment landline next. No answer. The knot in his stomach tightened. Whatever problems existed between them, Susan was reliable when it came to Alex. For her to miss the reading program without calling was unthinkable. He drove toward Elm Street, his mind racing through possibilities. The Carter apartment complex appeared normal when Mark arrived. Susan's Honda sat in the parking lot, doors locked, no signs of disturbance. He climbed the steps to apartment 2B and knocked firmly. "Susan? It's Mark." The library called. "Where's Alex?" "Nothing." Mrs. Henderson appeared from across the parking lot. "She hasn't answered all day," she called. "I was getting worried myself." Mark tried the doorknob, found it locked, and pulled out his phone. Despite the restraining order's complications, this situation transcended their legal disputes. He dialed 911. Officer James Morrison arrived 20 minutes later, his patrol car attracting the attention of neighbors. Morrison knocked on the apartment door with official authority. "Police department, we're conducting a welfare check." The silence that followed felt dense with possibility. Morrison radioed for assistance and the apartment manager. The door swung open, revealing an apartment frozen in mid-soutine. Susan's purse sat on the kitchen counter, contents scattered. Her essential medications remained in their bottles beside the kitchen sink. A coffee cup sat half empty next to the morning newspaper. Morrison called out as he moved through the rooms. "Hello? Police department?" In Alex's bedroom, Morrison stopped. The room was tidy, but something caught his eye. A small hole in the wall near the window, about 4 feet from the floor. The hole was roughly circular, with plaster dust scattered on the floor beneath it. Morrison had seen enough similar holes to recognize what he was looking at. He radioed for backup and a crime scene team. "I'm going to need everyone to step back from the apartment," he told the growing crowd of neighbors. "This is now a potential crime scene." Within an hour, the Carter apartment buzzed with activity. Detective Raymond Walsh arrived to take control of the investigation. Crime scene technicians photographed every room and collected potential evidence. The hole in Alex's bedroom wall commanded immediate attention. Detective Walsh knelt beside it, flashlight in hand, peering into the plaster and wood. "Looks like a bullet hole," he told his partner, Detective Lisa Chen. Using dental picks and small brushes, technicians began the delicate work of retrieving the object embedded in the wall. After 30 minutes of careful excavation, they extracted a deformed bullet, its lead surface scratched and dented. More importantly, dark stains on the bullet's surface suggested the presence of biological material. "Bag it for DNA testing," Walsh instructed, "and get it to ballistics." The bullet represented the investigation's first concrete evidence that violence had occurred in the apartment. Combined with Susan and Alex's unexplained absence, it transformed a missing persons case into a potential homicide investigation. The forensic lab in Charleston confirmed what investigators suspected. The dark stains on the bullet were Alex's blood. The ballistics analysis revealed the bullet came from a .22 caliber weapon, likely a handgun fired at close range. The angle of impact suggested the shooter had been standing near Alex's bedroom door. Detective Walsh stared at the forensic report, feeling the weight of confirmation. The bullet hole and blood evidence proved that Alex had been shot in her bedroom, almost certainly fatally. But where were the bodies? And who had killed a 10-year-old girl and her mother? The investigation expanded to include registered gun owners throughout Raleigh County. Dozens of residents owned .22 caliber weapons, popular for small game hunting and target shooting in rural West Virginia. Larry Webb's name appeared on the list. He owned a .22 caliber revolver, registered when he purchased it from a local gun shop in 1997. Detective Chen conducted Webb's initial interview. She found him cooperative but unremarkable. A quiet man who seemed genuinely concerned about his missing neighbors. His truck's unusual parking position that morning was easily explained. He sometimes used the maintenance area when his usual spot was blocked by delivery trucks. Webb's criminal record was clean. He had lived in his house for 15 years, worked steadily at the coal processing plant, and paid his bills on time. Neighbors described him as polite but private. The FBI joined the investigation, treating it as a potential kidnapping case. Special Agent Catherine Ross established a command post and began coordinating with local investigators. "We're looking at this as an abduction homicide," Agent Ross explained. "The evidence suggests Alex was killed in her bedroom, then both bodies were removed. This required planning, transportation, and disposal method." Search teams combed Raleigh County's rural areas while detectives interviewed anyone who had contact with the Carter family. The Appalachian terrain offered countless secluded spots for hiding bodies, but it also meant vast areas to cover with limited resources. Mrs. Henderson provided additional details during her formal interview. She remembered Webb's truck being parked unusually that morning, but she also recalled seeing other unfamiliar vehicles in the area. A red sedan had appeared several times, and she had noticed a man walking through the complex who didn't seem to belong. "People are scared," Mrs. Henderson told Detective Chen. "Nobody wants to think there's a killer living nearby, but that's what the evidence suggests." The fear was palpable throughout Beckley. Parents walked their children to summer programs instead of letting them go alone. The Carter disappearance had shattered the community's sense of safety. Local churches organized prayer vigils for Susan and Alex's safe return, though privately many attendees had begun to assume the worst. The bullet and blood evidence made survival seem unlikely. As August dragged toward September, hundreds of tips poured in from across the region, each requiring verification and follow-up. Most led nowhere. False sightings, mistaken identities, and well-intentioned but inaccurate reports. "We're missing something," Walsh told his partner during one of their late-night strategy sessions. The killer had to dispose of two bodies somewhere relatively close. They're buried within 50 miles of here, probably much closer. The investigation continued through the fall of 2000, gradually shifting from active search to cold case status. Media attention faded as newer stories claimed headlines. The reward fund remained available, but tips became less frequent and less credible. Mark Carter returned to work, though colleagues noted his distraction and weight loss. The custody battle that had once consumed his energy became meaningless. There was no child to fight over anymore. The investigation officially transitioned to cold case status on January 15, 2001, exactly 5 months after Susan and Alex vanished. Detective Walsh kept the files on his desk, reviewing them periodically for overlooked details, but active resources shifted to newer cases. 23 years passed, like seasons, changing imperceptibly at first, then suddenly undeniable. The Carter case files gathered dust in evidence storage, boxes of photographs and witness statements that told an incomplete story. Detective Walsh had retired, taking with him the institutional memory of those frantic weeks in 2000. Beckley had changed in subtle ways. New families moved into the apartment complex, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded in apartment 2B. Missing persons posters in store windows had faded and been replaced by newer concerns. The case had become part of local folklore, a ghost story that longtime residents shared with newcomers. Mrs. Henderson had moved to a senior living facility, but maintained her role as keeper of the Carter family's memory. She could still recall Alex's excited chatter about the summer reading program, still picture Susan's tired smile as they walked to their car for the last time. Mark Carter had remarried and built a quiet life marked by small rituals of remembrance. Alex's birthday each year, Christmas presents donated to children's charities in her memory. The passage of time had softened the sharp edges of grief, but not erased the underlying ache. 23 years feels like yesterday and forever at the same time, Mark told a reporter during a brief anniversary interview. "Part of me keeps waiting for the phone to ring with news. Another part has accepted that I may never know what happened." Larry Webb remained a fixture in his house behind the complex, though age and isolation had transformed him from quietly withdrawn to nearly invisible. Now in his 70s, he rarely left his property except for essential errands and medical appointments. The coal plant had closed in 2016, leaving Webb with a small pension and Social Security. His garden had become legendary among neighbors, an expansive display of vegetables and flowers that suggested obsessive attention to detail. Webb worked in the yard during early morning hours and late evenings, avoiding heat and the possibility of extended conversations. "Mr. Webb keeps to himself, but his property is beautiful," noted Sarah Kim, a recent resident with a view of Webb's backyard. "It's like having a park behind our building. My kids love looking at all the flowers, though Mr. Webb gets nervous if they get too close to the fence." Webb's routine had crystallized into predictable patterns. Grocery shopping every Tuesday morning when stores were empty, medical appointments scheduled for earliest available times, banking conducted online to avoid crowds and conversation. The few neighbors who remembered Webb from earlier decades noted his gradual change from quiet but approachable to almost pathologically private. No one considered sinister explanations. Detective Maria Santos had been assigned to conduct a fresh review of the Carter files as part of her training in cold case procedures. Her outsider's perspective might identify overlooked details. "Reading through 23 years of files is like watching a very long, slow movie," Santos explained to her supervisor. "The evidence builds a clear picture of what happened, but the perpetrator's identity remains elusive." Technology had advanced significantly since 2000. Improved DNA analysis could extract genetic information from smaller samples. Satellite imagery could help identify potential burial sites that earlier searches might have missed, but technology required evidence to analyze, and the Carter case remained frustratingly short of physical clues beyond the bullet. The case had acquired a kind of folklore status within the community. High school students occasionally chose it as subjects for research projects. Online forums featured lengthy discussions about evidence and theories. Some amateur researchers focused on Larry Webb, noting his proximity and gun ownership, but speculation went nowhere without additional evidence. Dr. Jennifer Oakes, the county's chief medical examiner, had reviewed the case during her orientation. "From a forensic perspective, we know Alex Carter was shot and killed," she explained to regional investigators. "The blood evidence confirms fatal injury, but legal closure requires either bodies or confession." As 2024 began, the Carter case seemed destined to remain forever unsolved. The original investigators had retired or moved on, witnesses had aged or died, evidence had been analyzed repeatedly with no new insights. But somewhere in Beckley, a 74-year-old man, was beginning to feel the weight of his own mortality. Larry Webb had carried his secret for nearly a quarter century, but time was running out. His health was failing, and the guilt that had lived quietly in his chest for so long was demanding to be heard. The confession that would finally solve West Virginia's most haunting cold case was still months away. But it was coming. Truth has its own timeline, and Larry Webb's was about to expire. Spring 2024 arrived early in Beckley, bringing with it an unexpected development in a case that most people had forgotten. Detective Santos had spent weeks reviewing the Carter files when she noticed something that previous investigators had noted but never fully pursued. Larry Webb's name appeared in witness statements as the owner of the oddly parked truck, but he had never been thoroughly re-interviewed using modern investigative techniques. Webb was now 74 years old, living alone in the house behind the apartment complex where Susan and Alex had vanished. His health had been declining. Neighbors noticed he moved more slowly, spent less time in his beloved garden, and made more frequent trips to medical appointments. "I want to take another look at Webb," Santos told Lieutenant Chen during their weekly case review. "Not because I suspect him necessarily, but because he's the only witness from that morning who's still alive and accessible. Mrs. Henderson is in memory care now. Mark Carter has told us everything he knows. Webb might remember details that seemed unimportant 24 years ago." Lieutenant Chen approved the follow-up interview. Cold cases sometimes broke when witnesses felt safer sharing information after decades had passed, or when aging suspects became careless about maintaining their stories. On a humid Tuesday morning in May, Detective Santos knocked on Webb's front door. The house looked exactly as it had in 2000, neat, well-maintained, surrounded by the elaborate gardens that had become Webb's signature. But the man who answered the door showed clear signs of aging and illness. Larry Webb appeared frail, his face gaunt and his movements deliberate. He invited Santos inside, offering coffee with the formal politeness of someone who rarely received visitors. "I remember the detective who talked to me back then," Webb said, settling into a worn recliner. "Lady Detective Chen, I think. Haven't heard anything about the case in years." Santos explained that the department periodically reviewed cold cases, looking for new angles or overlooked details. She asked Webb to recount his memories of August 8, 2000, emphasizing that even small details might prove important. Webb's account matched his previous statements almost perfectly, unusual for someone recalling events from nearly 24 years earlier. He had worked late at the coal plant the night before, had parked his truck near the maintenance shed because his usual spot was blocked, had gone directly inside his house without socializing. "Did you see Susan and Alex that morning?" Santos asked. "Saw them walking to their car, like always. Susan looked tired, but that wasn't unusual. She had a lot of stress with the divorce and custody business. You owned a .22 caliber revolver at the time? You still have it?" Webb hesitated, the first crack in his composed demeanor. "Sold it years ago. Didn't need it anymore after I stopped hunting." "When did you sell it? Do you remember? To whom?" "Private sale? Maybe 2005 or 2006. Fellow from out of town. Paid cash. Didn't get his name." Santos made notes, though she knew the gun sale story would be impossible to verify. Private firearms transactions in West Virginia didn't require documentation, and memories from 18 years ago would be unreliable. The interview lasted an hour, covering the same ground that previous investigators had explored. Webb remained cooperative but increasingly tired. As Santos prepared to leave, she noticed Webb's hands shaking slightly, a tremor that could indicate medication side effects, neurological issues, or simple nervousness. "Mr. Webb, is there anything else about that morning that you remember? Anything at all, no matter how small it might seem?" Webb was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up, Santos saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there earlier, a flicker of emotion that might have been fear or guilt or simple exhaustion. "No," Webb said finally, "nothing else I can think of." Santos left her business card and asked Webb to call if he remembered anything additional. As she walked to her car, she noticed him watching through his front window. Not unusual behavior, but something about his posture suggested anxiety rather than simple curiosity. Over the following weeks, Santos researched Webb more thoroughly than previous investigators had. His employment records showed consistent attendance and good performance evaluations. Financial records revealed modest savings and no unusual expenditures around the time of the disappearance. Medical records, obtained through proper legal channels, showed recent diagnoses of diabetes and early-stage heart disease. The heart condition interested Santos. Webb's doctor had prescribed medications that carried side effects including anxiety, depression, and in some cases, increased emotional volatility. People facing serious health issues sometimes experience changes in their psychological state, increased introspection, guilt over past actions, or desire for confession. In June, Webb was hospitalized for what appeared to be a minor heart episode. Santos learned about the admission through her routine monitoring of local hospital reports, a practice she had developed for tracking potential witnesses or suspects in her active cases. She visited Webb in the hospital, ostensibly to check on his welfare, but actually hoping that the stress of medical treatment might make him more talkative. Hospital environment environments sometimes lowered people's psychological defenses, making them more likely to share information they had previously kept secret. Webb appeared more frail than he had during their spring interview. IV lines snaked from his arms, and monitors displayed his vital signs in constantly changing numbers, but his mental state seemed sharper, perhaps clearer than it had been in months. "Detective Santos," he said when she entered his room, "didn't expect to see you here. I heard you were in the hospital. Wanted to check on you and see how you're feeling. Doctors say it's not serious this time. Warning shot, they call it. But at my age, every warning shot might be the last one." Santos pulled a chair close to Webb's bed and sat down. Something about his tone suggested he wanted to talk, needed to unburden himself of something that had been weighing on his mind. "Mr. Webb, you've lived in Beckley your whole life. You've seen the community struggle with the Carter case for over 2 decades. Is there anything you'd want people to know? Anything that might help bring closure to their families?" Webb stared at the ceiling for several minutes. His monitors continued their electronic beeping, marking heartbeats that might be numbered now. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There are things a man carries his whole life," he said. "Things that eat at him, especially when he gets old and starts thinking about what comes after." Santos leaned forward, sensing that Webb was approaching something significant. "What kind of things, Mr. Webb?" But before he could answer, a nurse entered to check his IV lines. The moment was broken, and Webb retreated back into polite conversation about hospital food and visiting hours. Santos left the hospital with a strong impression that Larry Webb knew more about the Carter disappearance than he had ever admitted. His comments about carrying burdens and thinking about death suggested someone wrestling with unresolved guilt. She began preparing for what might be Webb's final interview, the conversation that could finally solve West Virginia's most haunting cold case. July brought oppressive heat to West Virginia, the kind of weather that made air conditioning units work overtime and sent electricity bills soaring. Larry Webb had been released from the hospital but remained weak, spending most of his time indoors during the hottest parts of the day. His garden, once meticulously maintained, showed signs of neglect as he struggled with the physical demands of outdoor work. Detective Santos received a call on a Thursday afternoon that changed everything. Webb had contacted the police station, asking to speak with her about something important regarding the Carter case. His voice on the phone sounded different, strained, urgent, as if he had made a decision that couldn't be reversed. Santos arrived at Webb's house within an hour. She brought backup recording equipment and informed Lieutenant Chen about the potential breakthrough. After 24 years of silence, Larry Webb appeared ready to talk. Webb met her at the door, his appearance even more haggard than during the hospital visit. His hand shook visibly and his eyes carried the haunted look of someone who had been wrestling with demons. "I've been thinking about what you said in the hospital," Webb began before Santos could sit down, "about bringing closure to families, about things a man carries." Santos activated her digital recorder and read Webb his Miranda rights, though he wasn't under arrest. She needed any statement he made to be legally admissible, following proper procedure, despite her eagerness to hear what he might reveal. "Mr. Webb, you contacted me today saying you had information about the Carter case. What would you like to tell me?" Webb settled into his recliner, the same chair where he had maintained his innocence for over 2 decades. His breathing was labored and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "I shot that little girl," he said simply, as if discussing the weather. "Alex, I shot her in her bedroom, and then I killed her mother. I've been carrying it for 24 years, and I can't carry it anymore." The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Santos felt her pulse quicken but forced herself to remain calm and professional. This was the moment she had been working toward, but it needed to be handled carefully. "Mr. Webb, I need you to tell me exactly what happened on August 8, 2000. Take your time and include every detail you remember." Webb closed his eyes and began to speak in a monotone voice, as if reciting a story he had rehearsed countless times in his mind. "I had been watching them for weeks. Susan and Alex, they had a routine. Same time every morning, walking to the car together. Susan was pretty, but she was troubled. I could see it in the way she moved, the way she looked around like she was expecting something bad to happen." Santos took notes while the recording equipment captured every word. Webb's confession was remarkably detailed, suggesting accurate memory rather than false admission. "That morning, I followed them back to the apartment after Susan dropped Alex at the library. But Alex wasn't at the library. I don't know why, but she came back with her mother. Maybe the program was canceled. Maybe Susan changed her mind about something." Webb paused to catch his breath, his confession taking visible physical effort. "I went into their apartment. I had been planning it for weeks, watching their routines, figuring out when Susan would be alone. But Alex was there, in her bedroom. She saw me and started to scream. I panicked and pulled my gun. The gun went off, and Alex, she fell down. and didn't get up. The details matched the forensic evidence perfectly. The bullet hole's position, the blood evidence, the angle of impact. Webb was describing the crime from the perspective of someone who had actually been there. "What happened to Susan?" Santos asked. "She came running when she heard the gunshot. She saw Alex on the floor and started screaming, crying, trying to help her. I couldn't let her call for help or identify me. I hit her with the gun until she stopped moving." Webb opened his eyes and looked directly at Santos for the first time since beginning his confession. "I put both bodies in my truck and brought them to my house. I buried them in my backyard, under the garden I've been tending all these years. They're still there, Detective. 24 years and they're still there." The confession answered every major question about the Carter case. The timeline, the evidence, the disposal method, all explained by a man who could no longer live with the weight of his secrets. Santos asked Webb to draw a map showing where the bodies were buried. His sketch showed 2 graves near the back of his property, close to the greenhouse where he started his seedlings each spring. For over 2 decades, he had been growing flowers above the remains of his victims. "Why are you telling me this now?" Santos asked. Webb's voice cracked for the first time during the confession. "I'm dying, Detective. Heart disease, diabetes, maybe cancer. The doctors are still running tests. I don't have long, and I can't meet my maker carrying the secret. Susan and Alex deserve to be found. Their family deserves to know what happened." The confession lasted 3 hours, with Webb providing details that only the killer could have known. He described Susan's clothes, Alex's backpack, the layout of their apartment, and the personal items he had seen during the crime. His account matched the evidence so precisely that Santos had no doubt she was hearing the truth. As evening approached, Santos called for additional units in the crime scene team. Webb's backyard would need to be excavated, and his confession would need to be verified through physical evidence. After 24 years, the Carter case was finally approaching resolution. Webb signed his written statement and consented to the search of his property. He seemed relieved, as if confessing had lifted a massive weight from his shoulders. "Will they arrest me now?" he asked Santos. "You're not under arrest yet, but you should contact an attorney. This confession will likely result in charges being filed." Webb nodded, unsurprised. "I've been ready for that for a long time. Prison doesn't scare me anymore. I'm more afraid of dying with this secret than dying in a jail cell." As crime scene units began setting up lights in Webb's backyard, Santos reflected on the strange nature of cold case investigations. 24 years of searching, thousands of hours of investigation, and breakthrough had come from a dying man's need for absolution. The excavation would take days, but Santos was confident they would find Susan and Alex Carter buried beneath the gardens that Larry Webb had tended with such obsessive care. His confession would finally bring closure to one of West Virginia's most haunting unsolved crimes. The excavation began at dawn the following morning, transforming Larry Webb's meticulously maintained backyard into a methodical archaeological dig. Crime scene technicians established a grid pattern over the area Webb had indicated in his hand-drawn map, marking off sections with stakes and string. The FBI sent a specialized team experienced in recovering remains from burial sites. Lieutenant Chen supervised the operation while Detective Santos continued interviewing Webb, seeking additional details that might help locate the exact burial sites. Webb remained cooperative, even walking investigators through his property despite his failing health. "I buried them deep," Webb explained, pointing to a section of his garden near the greenhouse. 6 feet down, maybe more. I wanted to make sure they wouldn't be found accidentally. The irony wasn't lost on investigators. For 24 years, the community had searched miles of wilderness and remote locations, while Susan and Alex lay buried 20 yards from the apartment where they had last been seen alive. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed anomalies in the soil consistent with disturbed earth and buried objects. The radar signatures suggested 2 distinct areas of disruption, matching Webb's description of separate graves. Jennifer Oakes arrived to oversee the recovery process. As county medical examiner, she would be responsible for examining any remains and confirming identifications. The work required extreme care. After more than 2 decades underground, the bodies would be severely decomposed, but proper excavation might preserve evidence that could corroborate Webb's confession. "We're treating this as both a crime scene and an archaeological site," Dr. Oakes explained to the assembled team. "Every bone, every fabric fragment, every piece of evidence needs to be documented and preserved." The first remains were uncovered on the second day of excavation. A section of deteriorated fabric emerged from the soil, dark blue material that matched the description of the shirt Alex had been wearing when she disappeared. The discovery sent a wave of emotion through the investigation team and the gathered media. Mrs. Henderson, now 87 and living in the senior facility, was informed of the developments by social workers. Despite her age and declining memory, she clearly remembered the events of August 8, 2000. "I always wondered about Larry's garden," she told the facility's activities coordinator. "He worked in that yard constantly, even in bad weather. Now I understand why." Mark Carter received the news in his home, where he had been following media coverage of the excavation. Lieutenant Chen called him personally to confirm that remains had been found and that Webb's confession appeared to be accurate. "After 24 years of not knowing, part of me isn't sure how to feel," Mark told reporters. Relief that there might finally be answers, anger that Alex and Susan were so close all this time, sadness that it took so long to find them. The excavation continued methodically. Skeletal remains consistent with a child were recovered from the first gravesite, along with fragments of clothing, jewelry, and personal items. A small backpack, deteriorated but recognizable, contained school supplies and library materials that matched items Alex had been carrying on her final morning. The second grave yielded adult remains, along with personal effects that matched Susan's description from the missing persons reports. A wedding ring, partially corroded but still identifiable, bore the inscription, "Mark and Susan Forever," a painful reminder of happier times before the relationship deteriorated into custody battles and restraining orders. DNA analysis would take several days, but Dr. Oakes felt confident that the remains belonged to Susan and Alex Carter. The burial positions, the associated evidence, and the correlation with Webb's detailed confession left little doubt about the identity. Larry Webb watched the excavation from his kitchen window, occasionally speaking with investigators who had additional questions about the burial process. His confession had been remarkably accurate. The locations, the depth of the graves, even the orientation of the bodies matched his descriptions. "I tried to bury them respectfully," Webb told Detective Santos during one of their follow-up conversations. "I knew what I had done was wrong, but I didn't want to treat them badly after it was over." The statement revealed the complex psychology of someone who could commit brutal murder but still felt compelled to show consideration for his victims after death. It was a contradiction that forensic psychologists would study for years to come. Media attention reached national levels as news outlets picked up the story of the solved cold case. Headlines focused on the shocking revelation that a killer had lived among his victims' community for over 2 decades, tending a garden above their graves while investigators searched unsuccessfully throughout the region. Webb's health continued deteriorating during the excavation period. He was hospitalized again with heart complications, but insisted on providing additional details that might help investigators understand the full scope of the crime. "I want to make sure you have everything," he told Santos during a bedside interview. "If I die before this gets to court, at least the confession and the evidence will tell the whole story." Legal experts debated whether Webb would live long enough to face trial. Prosecutors were prepared to file first-degree murder charges, but Webb's age and medical condition made his fitness for trial questionable. The excavation concluded after 5 days of careful work. Both grave sites had been completely excavated, and all recovered remains and evidence had been transported to the State Forensic Laboratory for analysis. The backyard that had been Larry Webb's pride for decades now resembled a construction site, with deep holes and disturbed earth marking where Susan and Alex Carter had rested for nearly a quarter century. DNA confirmation arrived 3 weeks later. Dr. Oakes called Lieutenant Chen with the official results. The remains were definitively those of Susan Carter, age 41, and Natasha Alex Carter, age 10. The identification process that had eluded investigators for 24 years was completed with scientific certainty in a matter of weeks. "The dental records and DNA profiles match conclusively," Dr. Oakes reported. "We can also confirm that the child's remains show evidence of gunshot trauma consistent with Webb's confession and the bullet recovered from the bedroom wall in 2000. Larry Webb died on August 15, 2024, exactly 2 weeks after the remains were discovered and 7 days before prosecutors had planned to file formal charges. He passed away in Beckley General Hospital, his confession having achieved what he described as his final act of honesty. His death complicated the legal resolution of the case. Without a defendant to prosecute, the criminal investigation could be officially closed but would never reach a courtroom. Webb's confession, corroborated by physical evidence, provided answers but not the formal justice that many sought. Detective Santos attended Webb's sparsely attended funeral, more as an observer than a mourner. The service was held in a small funeral home chapel, with fewer than a dozen attendees, mostly distant relatives, who had remained in contact despite Webb's increasing isolation over the years. "He was always quiet, even as a child," said Webb's elderly cousin Marie Collins, "but I never thought Larry could hurt anyone. He seemed so gentle, so careful about everything." The revelation that Webb had been a killer shocked those few people who had known him personally. His co-workers at the coal plant described him as reliable but unremarkable, someone who completed his assignments competently but rarely engaged in conversation. "Larry kept to himself, but he wasn't unfriendly," recalled Tom Martinez, Webb's former supervisor. "He just seemed to prefer his own company. Looking back, I wonder if he was carrying this guilt all those years, if that's why he was so withdrawn. The formal case closure ceremony took place in September 2024 at the Beckley Police Department. Lieutenant Chen announced that the Carter disappearance was officially solved, with Larry Webb identified as the perpetrator based on his detailed confession and corroborating physical evidence. Unfortunately, Mark Carter attended the announcement accompanied by his wife Linda and several family members who had maintained hope for answers throughout the decades of uncertainty. His statement to the media was brief but heartfelt. "We finally know what happened to Susan and Alex," Mark said, his voice steady despite visible emotion. "It doesn't bring them back, and it doesn't erase 24 years of not knowing, but it gives us closure. We can finally lay them to rest properly." The community reaction was complex. Relief at having answers, mixed with shock at the revelation that a killer had lived among them undetected for so long. Webb's neighbors struggled to reconcile their memories of a quiet, polite man with the reality of someone who had committed murder and hidden bodies in his backyard. "I walked past that garden thousands of times," said Sarah Kim, who had lived in the apartment complex for 5 years. "My children played in the yard next to where Susan and Alex were buried. It's horrifying to think we were so close to them all this time." The case attracted attention from criminologists and law enforcement professionals interested in how a killer could successfully hide in plain sight for decades. Webb's methodical approach to concealing the crime, combined with his ability to maintain normal behavior patterns, made him a case study in criminal psychology. Dr. Michael Stein, the forensic psychologist who had profiled the Carter case years earlier, noted that Webb's confession fitted the behavioral patterns he had predicted. "Webb demonstrated the organizational skills and emotional control I described in my original analysis," Dr. Stein observed. "His ability to carry on normal activities while concealing such a significant secret suggests someone with strong psychological compartmentalization abilities." The Carter family held funeral services for Susan and Alex in October 2024, more than 24 years after their deaths. The services were held at St. Matthew's Church, where Susan had occasionally attended during the difficult months before her disappearance. Hundreds of people attended: family members, former neighbors, investigators who had worked the case, and community members who had followed the story over the decades. The services represented both an ending and a beginning, the final goodbye that had been impossible during the years of uncertainty, and the start of a healing process that could now begin with definitive answers. Detective Santos delivered a brief eulogy for Susan and Alex, speaking on behalf of the law enforcement officers who had never stopped searching for them. Susan and Alex Carter were taken from their family and community by a senseless act of violence, Santos said, but they were never forgotten. Their case remained active in our hearts and minds for over 2 decades. Today we can finally say, you have been found, you will be remembered, and you can rest in peace. The graves in Beckley Cemetery were marked with simple headstones bearing their names, birth and death dates, and a shared inscription, "Together always, mother and daughter." The cemetery plot was donated by the community, a gesture of collective mourning for victims who had touched so many lives despite their tragic end. Mrs. Henderson, now in the advanced stages of dementia, was brought to the funeral service by caregivers from her senior facility. Though her recent memory was severely impaired, she seemed to recognize the significance of the occasion, sitting quietly during the service with tears streaming down her face. The Carter case officially closed with Webb's death, and the recovery of the victims' remains. Detective Santos was assigned to new cases, but she kept the Carter files on her desk as a reminder of how persistence and attention to detail could eventually yield justice, even after decades of frustration. The house where Webb had lived was sold by his estate to developers who demolished it and divided the property into smaller lots. The backyard where Susan and Alex had been buried was covered with new construction, erasing the physical evidence of their long concealment, but the apartment complex where they had lived remained largely unchanged. New tenants occupied apartment 2B, most unaware of its tragic history. Mrs. Rodriguez, the complex manager, occasionally shared the story with residents who seemed interested in local history, treating it as part of Beckley's collective memory rather than a current threat. Mark Carter established a small memorial fund in Susan and Alex's names, providing support for families dealing with missing persons cases. The fund offered resources for search efforts, counseling services, and legal assistance, practical help for people trapped in the same uncertainty that had dominated his life for nearly a quarter century. "Nobody should have to wait 24 years for answers," Mark explained during the fund's launch announcement. "If this memorial can help even one family find their loved ones sooner or cope with the uncertainty better, then something positive will have come from our tragedy." The resolution of the Carter case provided closure for the immediate family and the Beckley community, but it also raised broader questions about cold cases and criminal justice. How many other killers were living normal lives while their victims remained missing? How many families were still waiting for answers that might never come? Detective Santos began working with state and federal agencies to apply lessons learned from the Carter investigation to other cold cases throughout West Virginia. Webb's successful concealment of his crimes for over 2 decades offered insights into how seemingly ordinary people could commit extraordinary evil and hide it effectively. The case also highlighted the importance of persistence in cold case investigations. Without Santos's decision to re-interview Webb using modern techniques, his confession might never have occurred. The breakthrough came not from new technology or evidence, but from an investigator's intuition that there was more to learn from a witness everyone had dismissed as unimportant. As 2024 drew to a close, the Carter case had become part of West Virginia's criminal justice history, a reminder that truth sometimes emerges only when we least expect it, carried by the guilty conscience of someone who can no longer bear the weight of their secrets. The final police report on the Carter case filled over 300 pages, documenting 24 years of investigation, thousands of tips, hundreds of interviews, and ultimately, one man's deathbed confession that solved one of the state's most haunting mysteries. Susan and Alex Carter were finally at rest. Their family had answers, and their community could begin the long process of healing from a tragedy that had haunted Beckley for nearly a quarter century. Justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied.